As we look back 250 years, the Declaration of Independence often seems inevitable. But if you look at events as they unfolded on the ground, it begins to feel a lot more improvised. Leaders push forward on multiple fronts. They're trying to deal with British occupation and impending war. They're kickstarting alliances and scraping together supplies. And they're building a facade of unity while finding a way forward through competing visions of the future. And in the background is this steady click, click of setting type and the bang of pulling the printing press. This rushed, messy, and improvised revolution can't happen without it. So when the Declaration of Independence does happen, we shouldn't be surprised that its printing feels rushed, messy, and improvised too. This is Found in Philadelphia, a podcast dedicated to telling the stories of Philadelphia's past so that we can better understand the present. Because our history matters. I'm your host, Lori Ament. With each episode, I hope that you'll learn something new, see things a little differently, and be inspired to go discover some of this history for yourself, right here in the city of brotherly love. This is part of a series for the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In this series, we're collaborating with some of the people who created the Encyclopedia Greater Philadelphia. We're taking this moment to reflect and ask questions about the city's past and what that means for us today. This episode picks up the story about printing the revolution from the previous episode, which you should definitely check out. We'll follow key events and documents leading up to the Declaration of Independence. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and tell a friend to check it out. You can read additional blog posts with lots of images, and you can sign up for the podcast newsletter at the website foundinphiladelphia.com. I want to start this episode by introducing you to Emily Sneff, historian of early America, a leading expert on the events of 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. She's author of When the Declaration of Independence Was News. She's also from the Philly area and is currently a consulting curator for exhibits at the Museum of the American Revolution and at Historic Trap.
We tend to think 250 years later that July 4th was always going to be the day. But if you were living in 1776, things were changing on a day-to-day basis. And so it wasn't abundantly clear that independence was going to happen until it happened.
Emily will be our guide for the events of 1776, and she reminds us that there's a lot going on in that year, and nothing was inevitable. So let's start with a look at events and important documents leading up to the creation of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. In the last episode, we learned about the arts and mysteries of printing in colonial Philadelphia. We walked around a print shop and looked into the business of printing. During the decade leading up to the Declaration of Independence, we saw how printers, acting as hubs of information, became central to the patriot cause. They helped begin the process of knitting together this loose confederation of British colonies into something new. And as tensions escalated in New England in 1773, we saw how printers' information networks and newspapers were now shaping events, not just reporting on them. That brings us to the year of 1774. Boston had just destroyed British tea in the harbor. As punishment, the British Parliament adopts a series of acts that colonists call the Intolerable Acts. By June of 1774, British troops enter the city and close the port of Boston, saying it will remain closed until Boston repays the cost of the lost tea, which isn't going to happen. They strip the colony of Massachusetts of its right to try British officials charged of crimes, and they also remove Boston's elected local government and replace it with a council appointed by the king. In the face of the British lockdown in Massachusetts, the rest of the colonies get organized. Everyday people raise money and send supplies to support the colonists blockaded in Boston. And the First Continental Congress meets at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. They send a handwritten petition to King George III, basically asking him very politely to back off. Benjamin Franklin takes this petition to London, where it's presented to Parliament in February 1775. But no one takes any notice of the colonists' petition, and neither the king nor Parliament ever send a formal reply. Okay, so now it's 1775. The British have been hunkering down in occupied Boston throughout the winter, surviving on dwindling supplies. In the spring, fighting starts between the British and New England militias, with the battles of Lexington and Concord, and a few months later, the Battle of Bunker Hill. More and more colonists leave Boston, with the pre-war population of about 10,000 now down to a little over 2,000. Patriot printers, like so many others, take what they can, their precious type, their heavy presses, and leave town. By June of 1775, the Second Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia in the State House, what we now call Independence Hall. They're working on multiple fronts. In hopes of some sort of peace, they agree on another petition to King George III, what's called the Olive Branch Petition. This was drafted by Pennsylvania's John Dickinson, who hoped to find a peaceful end to the violence. This petition is a formal, handwritten document signed by members of the Continental Congress, beginning with, "We, your majesty's faithful subjects of the colonies." They blame the recent unrest on Parliament, who, quote, "abuse your royal confidence and authority for the purpose of effecting our destruction." They beseech the king to provide relief to his, quote, "most affectionate colonists." They send this petition off to London with Richard Penn of Pennsylvania and Arthur Lee of Virginia. At the same time that they're drafting the Olive Branch Petition, the Continental Congress is also preparing for war. In June of 1775, the Congress tasks George Washington with taking command of the colonial militias dug in outside of Boston. They hope that sending a Virginian will emphasize that their cause is truly unified across the colonies. Then they set Thomas Jefferson to work on a declaration. A different one. This is the 1775 Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. And that's the short version. It's probably one of the most important documents to come out of the Continental Congress until it's eclipsed by the Declaration of Independence a year later. Jefferson's draft of the 1775 Declaration was reworked and sweetened up a bit by John Dickinson. The final version of the Declaration outlines the many abuses of power the colonists have suffered, the unjustified violence they face in Boston, and places the blame on British Parliament and military officers, not the king. The, quote, "inhabitants of these colonies claim that they are taking up arms as a necessity, a last resort to protect their rights. They resolve to fight, quote, with one mind united, to die free men rather than to live slaves." And because both Dickinson and Jefferson were slaveholders, these men knew what they were talking about. But as they ended the declaration, they state that they still hope to reconcile with the king. The 1775 Declaration was a lengthy document that was printed as a nicely laid out pamphlet using Caslon typeface by Philadelphia printer William Bradford and his son Thomas. Bradford was a longtime Patriot champion and owner of the Old London Coffee House. Unlike the handwritten petitions to the king, the 1775 Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms was printed for a broader audience. It needed to persuade the colonists to support the newly formed army. It needed to provide justification for those already fighting the war in Massachusetts. It also needed to be seen by potential allies in Europe. So, in order to reach as many people as possible, it was sent out as a printed pamphlet and was reprinted in newspapers across North America and across the Atlantic. Now it's August 1775. The king refuses to receive the Olive Branch Petition. And when he hears the news of heavy British casualties at the Battle of Bunker Hill, he issues a proclamation of rebellion. He demands that officials of the empire do their utmost to suppress the colonists' open rebellion. This is reprinted using Caslon type in the form of a broadside for broad distribution. Remember, broadsides were like posters, printed across a full sheet of paper, maybe 16 by 21 inches, ready for distribution to the public. By the end of 1775, fighting spreads into Maine and Quebec. Lord Dunmore, the colonial governor of Virginia, issues and prints his own proclamation. Dunmore declares that all indentured servants and the enslaved that are able and willing to bear arms for the British are free, but only if they leave the service of rebel colonists. Historians estimate that 20,000 enslaved people eventually joined the British forces. Congress tasks Philadelphia printer John Dunlap with printing their own broadside with their response to the King's petition of rebellion. Dunlap's broadside is laid out in Caslon with 2 columns, nice wide margins, and the broadside speaks of Britons fighting against Britons in a civil war, even though members of the Continental Congress are already discussing among themselves how best to set up new independent governments for the former colonies. Now it's 1776. One of the year's most influential pamphlets is printed in Philadelphia early that year. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, printed by Robert Bell, urges the inhabitants of America to break with the king, who only got his job because he was born into it. So while many people are already angry with Parliament and British military leaders, Paine's easy-to-read arguments set the majority of readers against the king, too. Here's Emily Sneff to explain.
A big factor in swaying public opinion was the publication of Common Sense, Thomas Paine's anonymous pamphlet, first printed in Philadelphia in January 1776. There's a German translation created in Philadelphia as well for the German reading public, and then it's also reprinted all over the colonies. And ultimately, Common Sense is even reprinted in London, censored, but still reprinted.
In the pamphlet, Paine writes, quote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. We were no longer Britons. We were Americans. Everyone's talking about it."
And it was really a viral sensation, something that people were reading and then talking about with one another and debating the fact that it seemed like it no longer made sense for an island to have rule over a continent, for the people in the colonies to keep writing back and forth to London and waiting for responses and not having a legal structure or a local government that really fit their needs. So all through early 1776, there's debates in taverns and coffee houses, in newspaper essays, and in the halls of the provincial congresses and the Continental Congress about whether independence makes sense or not.
And let's not forget that the colonists are still at war with a global superpower in 1776, and the British are still hunkered down in Boston. But in March, General William Howe is forced to evacuate the British Army from Boston. George Washington and his troops get their hands on some well-traveled cannons and turn them on British positions in the city. General Howe calls for a truce and departs to the naval base of Halifax in Nova Scotia. There he awaits the arrival of his brother, Vice Admiral Richard Howe, who's coming with naval reinforcements and a contingent of formidable Hessian soldiers from the area we now call Germany. The colonists brand them foreign mercenaries. Both Washington and the Howe brothers know that the next battlefront will be New York. It's just a matter of time. Also in March, the Continental Congress send Silas Deane, delegate from Connecticut, on an undercover mission to France to negotiate an alliance. By the spring of 1776, talk of independence is in the air. New Hampshire had jumped the gun and adopted a new state constitution in January. South Carolina adopts theirs in March. By April, John Adams, Continental Congress delegate from Massachusetts, is being asked for advice on how the other colonies should create their own governments, just in case. Adams is in Philadelphia at this point, and he has printer John Dunlap print a pamphlet titled "Thoughts on Government Applicable to the Present State of the American Colonies." Adams advocates for a form of government with a legislative branch with two bodies, an upper and a lower one. Adams' pamphlet heavily influences state constitutions, and later the federal constitution as well. The pamphlet becomes a handy how to form your own government at a time when the colonies are busy working on their own independent state constitutions. In May of 1776, the Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia for its spring session. And one of the first things they do is pass a resolution stating that the former colonies, if they haven't already, should each form independent governments. This is a remarkable, fairly short document, which was printed by John Dunlap for wide distribution. Following John Adams' fiery preamble, the resolution speaks to the, quote, united colonies, who are directed to form governments that are conducive to, quote, the happiness and safety of their constituents in particular, and America in general. Emily Sneff states that this resolution, using the terms United Colonies and America, calling for the formation of independent governments, this was seen by many as a declaration of independence. I mean, it was certainly seen that way on the other side of the Atlantic. By this point in May, John Dunlap has also printed an item in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Packet, that warns the public that the British are sailing towards their shores with ships full of foreign mercenaries. Everyone knows a broader war is imminent. Congress also has Silas Deane negotiating in secret to form an alliance with France, and their own home colonies are debating the best forms of government for their new state constitutions. I mean, they've got a lot on their plate. How do you squeeze in time to declare independence? And is it even necessary? Congress gets some clarity on their path forward in early June, when delegates from Virginia arrive. They propose what is sometimes called the Virginia Resolution, or sometimes the Lee Resolution, after Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee. Here's Emily.
So the Lee resolutions call for these three things that ultimately happened at different moments, but in 1776 were thought of in tandem with one another. So independence, confederation, and foreign alliances. There was a real debate within the Continental Congress about whether it was best to declare independence first, or to find a foreign ally first, or to have confederation first.
I mean, if you step back from our knowledge in the present day that the Declaration of Independence is going to be approved on July 4th, it's an interesting question. At this point in June 1776, what was most important? Should you negotiate for money and military support from allies to fight the war? Or should you just declare yourself an independent nation of the United States who has the right to negotiate foreign alliances? Or should you actually form a confederation of the United States first so you can claim you're an independent nation so you can then negotiate an alliance? So what did the Continental Congress do? Well, they moved forward on all three fronts. With the British arriving any day, they didn't have time to waste. In early June 1776, the Continental Congress sets up three committees to address each of the agenda items in the Virginia Resolution. A committee to work on a plan for the confederation of the former colonies, another committee to draft a model treaty for foreign alliances, and a third committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. They table debate about declaring independence until July 1st, when they can review what the committees come up with, and so the delegates can ensure they have the votes. Here's Emily to tell us what drafting the Declaration looked like.
The 5-member committee tasked with drafting the Declaration of Independence had Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who becomes the principal author of the Declaration, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert R. Livingston of New York. The committee had about 3 weeks to work on a Declaration of Independence, but they were extremely busy. So it's not as if they spent 3 weeks solid writing the Declaration. They wrote it in spare moments. And there was some editing that went on within the committee. On one of Thomas Jefferson's drafts, there are handwritten notes of edits that were made by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. We don't know as much about what Roger Sherman or Robert R. Livingston might have contributed.
The Declaration of Independence is structured as a legal argument. It begins with the introduction or preamble that presents self-evident truths. The middle section is known as the grievances. This is a list of facts that show how these truths have been violated. And then it ends with the conclusion or the resolution, which is the justified outcome of these violations. In this case, free and independent states absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. We tend to remember the idealistic language at the beginning and the end of the Declaration of Independence, from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to the pledging of our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. But Emily urges us all to look at that list of grievances to help us understand this complicated moment in time.
There's all of these other factors happening, and if we read the Declaration of Independence, we see them reflected in the list of grievances. We see fears about Native American violence on the quote-unquote frontiers of the colonies. We see fears about mercenary soldiers, hired soldiers coming from Europe to join the British side of the war. They had not yet arrived, but they were on their way.
Emily also reminds us to pay attention to the audience for the Declaration of Independence.
Previous petitions issued by the Continental Congress had been addressed to the king. They're addressed, to His Majesty from his most loyal subjects in hopes that he'll be able to resolve their grievances. That fails. And so the Declaration of Independence takes a different tact where the king is no longer the audience, he is the subject. And the audience is, to quote the Declaration, a candid world.
Okay, so the committee has a draft of the Declaration. What happens next?
They present their draft on Friday, June 28th, the Friday before the debate was set to resume on Monday, so ahead of schedule.
On the following Monday, July 1st, Congress begins debate on whether or not to declare independence right now. Remember, they also have the other priorities listed in the Virginia Resolution: to form foreign alliances and to create a confederation.
In June of 1776, there's really a lot of disagreement over whether independence should be declared before these other pieces. And some of the delegates who are remembered as being against independence weren't totally against independence. They were just thinking about the timing of things and the order of independence, confederation, and foreign alliances. In 1776, no one in the Continental Congress knew if they would be able to win the war. Most of the delegates in the Continental Congress would have rather been in their home colonies working on new constitutions. Jefferson would have rather been in Virginia than in Philadelphia. He really wanted to work on the Virginia Constitution. So everyone has multiple priorities at the same time. Not to mention, there is a massive British fleet on its way to New York at the moment that the Continental Congress is debating independence. So George Washington is pretty preoccupied. And then think about the men in Congress. They have families, they have businesses.
Pennsylvania delegate John Dickinson, the author of so many petitions to the king, had deep reservations about declaring independence at this point.
On July 1st, when the debate about whether to declare independence or not resumes, John Dickinson gives this really impassioned speech. And we have his notes from his speech. And within his notes, he used this metaphor that the sending out a Declaration of Independence without having allies or a confederation among the colonies was like braving a storm in a skiff made of paper. So a skiff would have been a pretty small boat that really is a powerful image, the Declaration being a boat sent out into a storm. It really is a reminder that the Continental Congress did not know what was going to happen to the Declaration once it left Independence Hall. Ultimately, it takes 2 days of debate to reach a consensus that, yes, we are going to declare independence from Great Britain. So on July 2nd, Congress votes to approve the resolution marking this transition from dependent British colonies to free and independent United States. As soon as they approve that resolution, they turn their attention to the Declaration of Independence, the press release explaining their decision. So from late in the day on July 2nd through July 3rd, they're working on the Declaration.
They shorten the document, make it more clear, and they spend a lot of time on that concluding resolution. They also edit the list of grievances.
There initially was a final grievance in the committee's draft, which talked about the transatlantic slave trade. And if you think about the list of grievances, they are all blaming King George. They're all about King George III's actions, even though some of them were actually undertaken by Parliament or his ministers or his governors. It's all about the king. The grievances begin, he has. And so to have the final grievance blame the king for the colony's reliance on the transatlantic slave trade seemed to some of the delegates to be a step too far.
In the end, historian Danielle believes the Declaration of Independence is an example of democratic writing. Compromises are made, and the final draft shows the messiness of finding consensus. And on July 4th, after 2 days of editing, the Continental Congress adopts the final Declaration of Independence, with only New York abstaining because they haven't received their instructions in time. It'll have to do. Now, the Continental Congress has to get this Declaration of Independence out to the candid world. Here's Emily again.
On July 4th, after the Continental Congress approves the Declaration of Independence, they turn their attention to publication. And the final paragraph of the Declaration actually specifically says, we solemnly publish and declare. So publication could take two forms. It could be a printed publication, but also you could have oral publication, reading the Declaration aloud, which would require that printed form. So they prioritize having broadsides of the Declaration of Independence printed.
So it's not going to be a pamphlet. The Congress prioritized printing the Declaration of Independence as a poster-sized broadside, and they wanted it done yesterday. Remember, Silas Deane is in France looking for allies, and George Washington is in New York City trying to figure out how to meet an expanded British military force. People went to sleep in a British colony and woke up in the United States of America. They needed to know. This is a job for mass media. And that meant the printing press. So the Continental Congress gives the job of printing the Declaration of Independence to John Dunlap. As we've seen, Dunlap had been a reliable go-to printer for the Congress, and his shop was just a few blocks away from Independence Hall at 2nd and Market Streets. They get him started as soon as possible. Here's Emily.
So John Dunlap has this responsibility of printing the first copies of the Declaration, of setting these broadsides. He had some oversight from the Continental Congress. He was working from a clean, handwritten copy of the text as approved by the Continental Congress, but someone needed to make sure that he was actually printing the text that they had approved. But otherwise, he had really control over the design of the broadside, and other printers end up copying his format of the Declaration in sort of a wide column with a nice big title. He also puts the date of the Declaration in Congress, July 4, 1776, at the top of the document. And that date follows the text as it travels, and ultimately is why we all think of July 4th as the day to celebrate independence, even though it took time for the news to spread. Only people in Philadelphia knew about the Declaration on July 4th.
Historians generally agree that Dunlap received the approved copy of the Declaration of Independence on the afternoon of July 4th. Congress asked him to print as many copies as he can, as fast as he can. This is an absolute rush job. Dunlap works through the evening of July 4th and is pulling prints ready for distribution by the following morning. I'd like to bring back our modern-day printer from the previous episode, Jessica Peterson. Jessica is the director of the Common Press, the University of Pennsylvania's letterpress and typography research lab. I asked Jessica to help us understand the task that Dunlap was undertaking on July 4th, 1776. Remember, Jessica's been working on printing replicas of the Declaration of Independence in her shop. She brings a printer's perspective.
So I say to my students that it's a 1776 version of a tweet to have the Declaration printed over the night of July 4th, 1776. And it just in that fact is a very revolutionary document that it was printed so quickly and distributed the next day. So that means there was between the late afternoon of July 4th, about 1,500 words were set in metal type. But we've tried to set that amount of text. We thought it would take about 10 hours, and it took a lot longer for us. Compared to John Dunlap, I'm not that fast of a typesetter, but I've been doing it for long enough to know that it took probably 10 hours to set the text.
At this point, Caslon is the preferred typeface or font for printing in English, so Caslon is what Dunlap will be setting to print the Declaration of Independence. Jessica pointed out another important consideration for setting all that type. overnight in the 18th century.
It was summer, so the sun didn't set till probably like 9 p.m. It's before electricity, which is something that I always forget about because we take electricity for granted. We did an event in December where we lit the print shop in candlelight and tried to set type. The type that Dunlap was setting is 11-point type, which is really small. It's probably like 1/8 of an inch. So when we were trying to typeset in candlelight in our print shop, it was virtually impossible to see what we were typesetting.
And while colonial printers put their names at the bottom of their work, it's important to remember that Dunlap was not the only person to work on the Declaration of Independence. Here's Jessica again.
We don't know what other workers were in John Dunlap's print shop. We assume to do that kind of operation at that time, you would need at least a couple of typesetters, and then you need at least 3 people to operate the printing press. So it wasn't just a solo activity. There were definitely people involved.
Now let's talk about the layout. If you look at a Dunlap broadside, they measure roughly 16 by 21 inches or so. And you'll see, as Emily Sneff pointed out, the large title at the top with big font set in all capital letters, "In Congress, July 4th, 1776, a declaration by the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled." And note how they no longer use the term United Colonies. Then comes the body of the text set in one long line running from left to right using 11-point font. From Jessica's perspective as a printer, this long line of text is not normal.
My idea is that he knew that he had to set this in one night. So rather than worrying about the design, he's like, we're going to make the longest line possible. It'll fit as many words as possible. And we're just going to print the text as it's given to us. And everyone can agree that line length is ridiculously long because it's really hard to read a whole line of the Declaration without losing your attention. That's why you should have shorter line lengths in typography.
So Jessica sees the layout as a sign of the rush to print the Declaration of Independence overnight. But there are other mistakes that can be seen in the printing of these original broadsides that also show haste. In 1976, historian Frederick Goff reviewed the Dunlap broadsides that remained, and he noted multiple mistakes that appear across the surviving prints. And Jessica sees some of these mistakes that Goff noted being caused by someone finding errors as they printed and making changes to the type.
I think they were probably proofing as they printed. There's some where there's words falling out or not in a direct line, which means that the type was locked and unlocked in a hasty way during the proofing process. And there's also some where the whole form is slanted. Every time you change the type, you have to lock and unlock the type in a form, and you have to spend time making sure everything's lined up before you relock it. And if you do it too hastily, those things happen.
Some copies of Dunlap's Declaration of Independence also show offset, which means that the freshly printed copies were folded before they were perfectly dry, causing ghosts of ink to appear on the page. And to wrap this up, let's talk about the paper. Dunlap was instructed to print as many copies of the Declaration as possible. Not only was he limited by time, but he was also limited by paper. Remember the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts that placed taxes on paper? The colonists had limited paper mills in the colonies at this point. One paper mill was located at the site of historic Rittenhouse Town on the Wissahickon in Philadelphia. But these mills weren't making good, durable paper. The best paper was still from Europe. Here's Emily Sneff to explain.
John Dunlap was able to print his broadsides on imported Dutch-made paper. And we know that from the watermarks on the paper. We can trace those back to specific Dutch paper presses. And so he made an effort to use this higher quality imported paper.
And we know that Dunlap exhausted his paper supply printing copies of the Declaration of Independence.
Later that month, he had run out of paper completely for his printing business and was using blue cartridge paper to print his newspaper. So within Dunlap's own printing office, we can see how he prioritized his limited stock of imported European paper for the Declaration and then had to use this sort of lesser locally made paper for the rest of his printing obligations that month.
So how many broadsides was Dunlap able to print during the afternoon and evening of July 4th and into the early morning of July 5th? Here's Emily again.
We don't know exactly how many he printed, but his broadsides had to go to a lot of different people, to the head of the Continental Army and different officers in different locations, to each of the states, plus members of Congress were sending them out to their family members and friends, and they were being used for public readings in Pennsylvania on Monday, July 8th. So it seems like he probably printed a few hundred broadsides.
And it's at this point that the Declaration of Independence starts a journey that continues to this day. Prints, still damp from the press, are folded and sent off in different directions to be read and proclaimed and reprinted and read again and again. The words of the Declaration begin to reach a candid world, who will take these words and make meaning of them, each from their own experience. In the next episode, we'll explore more stories about what some people took from the Declaration of Independence. And we'll talk about that other handwritten version too. Thank you for listening to the Found in Philadelphia podcast. Please check out the podcast website at foundinphiladelphia.com to learn more, see some period images, and find a list of my sources. This episode was researched, written, hosted, and recorded by me, Lori Almond. Huge thanks to our audio engineer, Carolina Duque, who mixed this episode and provided sound engineering. Music for this episode was produced, composed, and arranged by Steve Secchi for Funk Soul Productions.